Water. It's one of Minecraft parkour's most hated gimmicks. Why? Because it feels inconsistent, unpredictable, and most of all, it's just boring and slow. And today, I'll attempt to shed some light on how water works, mainly focusing on water blips, and from there covering the mechanics of the famous Water Plus 2 and some other bugs along the way. So first off, we'll explain the conditions for when a water blip can occur. The code that is executed during a water blip is this. It may look complex, but it's surprisingly simple. Essentially, on the tick that the player leaves the water, make sure to be colliding with the wall, and there you go. Water blip by setting the player's Y speed to 0.3. Easy, right? Unfortunately, I did simplify it a bit, and going deeper, it will be easier to explain if I break it down into two cases. Blips that occur when leaving from the side of the water, and blips when leaving from the top of the water. We'll first investigate the horizontal case. Looking back at the code, you might notice that motion X and motion Z are what gets called, not velocity. Motion is actually the acceleration carried from the previous tick before adding the rest of the current tick's velocity. There are some interesting consequences of motion being used over velocity. First, it's possible to blip without ever leaving the water's hitbox, but as far as I know, this is completely useless. Second, it also explains some of the famous rank up fails that have happened due to water blips, like this Cammy fail, and as well as this Godzilla arcade fail. We'll analyze Godzilla's clip here, mainly because he has organized and in-focus labels that will make explaining things easier. Looking at our motion equation for water, we simply have to sub in the previous tick's velocity, which is 0.0672 blocks per tick, multiply it by drag, 0.8 in water's case, and calculate his motion to be 0.0538. With this value, we can see where he is on the next tick according to his motion. Here, we can see he moved to 0.711 in motion, still within the water's hitbox. Therefore, although he's left the water, the game says no blip should occur. On the subsequent tick, his motion is now out of the water, but since he's no longer colliding with any wall, there will be no blip either, resulting in this tragic LD fail. So how can we avoid situations like this? Well, unfortunately, there's no real way to avoid unlucky motion calculations like this. The only way you can guarantee a blip is by leaving from the top of the water. So let's analyze that situation now. In this situation that we leave from the top, we can see that the code is very strange compared to the horizontal case. It instead checks if motion Y plus 0.6 is outside of the water, then subtracts the current Y position and adds D0. This D0 variable is equal to the current Y position, so it seemingly cancels itself out for no reason. Maybe someone can explain that in the comments. Now to explain the additional 0.6, I believe it was added as a bit of a workaround coding due to the differences in the water's hitbox and bounding box. Although the water's hitbox is 1 by 0.6 by 1, when the game checks if the offset position is in a liquid, it assumes a normal block's bounding box of 1 by 1 by 1. Therefore, without that additional height, the player would never be able to blip as bobbing in the water never exceeds the top of the true bounding box. To follow up on this, the highest point where the player is considered in water is 0.599, but remember, the game checks for the Y motion plus 0.6 for blipping. This means that you can actually blip vertically starting from Y equals n.4. This explains the popular AFK setup with the water and the fence, because although motion Y is 0, a fence brings the player to Y equals n.5, so when a wall is collided, the game checks for 0.6 above the player, sees it's outside of the water, and continuously blips them. You might have noticed before that blips sometimes result in a Y velocity of 0.34, but the code said before that we should only blip with 0.3 speed. It's a valid question, and it's because the code that checks for blips runs before the game checks if jump is being held. When jump is held in water, the game adds 0.04 by default. Therefore, if a blip occurs within the water's bounding box, the game first sets speed to 0.3, sees we are still holding jump in water, and adds another 0.04, resulting in the 0.34 speed we see. There's one last thing to know before we can explain the Water Plus 2, and that is the jump is actually simple, if the upper water is moved one block across. This is another problem with the vertical check adding 0.6. If there is a block within that 0.6 distance above the player, it prevents any blip from happening, which we can verify by checking our offset position and liquid flag here. Once again though, although not a block, this is true for water too, as the game considers its bounding box to be a full block as well. With that, we have all the knowledge to explain the Water Plus 2, so we will do a tick by tick analysis of it on HBK. So to start, jam and release W and wait for the third peak. Waiting for the third peak is done because that gets us to a height that actually reaches the upper water. Next is press W, then W plus D, and then switch to W plus A. The W is used to initiate the first blip, as we are now colliding with the wall and above Y equals 72.4. Now looking at the W plus D tick, we actually trigger a second blip, as we are still colliding with the wall. Therefore, we've met the conditions and can expect our Y velocity to be 0.3. Since we used W plus D, the player moved right, moving us outside the upper water's bounding box, allowing the second blip to occur. From there, the W plus A is simply used to move us back into the upper water's hitbox and letting us complete the jump. And after all that, that's the water plus 2 finally explained. Fortunately, since blips give a hard-coded speed of 0.3, this is about the limit for vertical distance jumps using water and lava, so we don't have to worry about a water plus 3 or anything like that coming along anytime soon. Now there's one last thing I want to address before ending this video, and I'm sure it's something a lot of people have been wondering about, and that's answering why water doesn't blip in the positive X and Z directions for Minecraft 1.8.9. I couldn't find the exact flaw in the code that causes it, but when hugging the wall, we can see that the offset position flag that allows blips to happen is set to false. I believe that in this version, the water's bounding box was set to be one float too large in these directions, as it triggers at coordinates 1 e to the minus 16th before wall collision is supposed to begin. Unfortunately, this means that nothing can really be done about avoiding it, and it's just a unique quirk to do with parkour on this version. There we go. That's almost everything to do with water and the blipping mechanics that come along with it. There are some things that I haven't gone over, such as flowing water, but this video was long enough already, so that's a topic for another day.